A girl left home to visit a friend, but never made it. At first, police couldn't find a single clue, and the case went cold. For years, it felt like the answer was right in front of them, but no one could put the pieces together. Decades passed, until one day everything changed, and the truth came out in a way no one expected. Claire Tiltman was born on January 14, 1977, in a small British village called Greenhithe. She was an only child and went to an all-girls school where she had a lot of friends. Even as a kid, Claire was focused and determined. She dreamed of becoming one of the first female firefighters in the country. In high school, she even volunteered at charity events organized by the local fire department, helping out however she could. Still, she wanted to get a college degree before going into that line of work. In January of 1993, when she was 16, Claire was in the middle of her final exams and thinking about her future education. On January 18th, just 4 days after her birthday, Claire headed out to a friend's house. They planned to talk about college options and figure out where they might want to apply. She left home around 6 p.m., telling her mom she'd be back in about an hour and a half. But when that time came and went, there was no sign of Claire. At first, her mom thought she probably just lost track of time, maybe stayed a bit longer at her friend's place. But when the clock passed 8 p.m., she started to get worried. She called the friend's house, only to find out Claire had never shown up. Thinking maybe plans had changed, she started calling a few of Claire's other friends, but no one had seen her that night. A few minutes later, Claire's mom stepped outside and ran into a neighbor. He mentioned that something had happened a few miles away. There were ambulances and a bunch of police cars at the scene. Claire's mom was really starting to worry, so she went straight to the local police station to report her daughter missing. She gave them a full description, but instead of taking her report, the officers told her to go home. They said there'd been some kind of incident and that someone would come by to explain everything soon. A little while later, police showed up at her door and gave her the news no parent ever wants to hear. Her daughter had been found dead just hours earlier. Earlier that evening, 2 men had been driving down a road that connected a few nearby towns. As they passed by some houses, they noticed a girl kneeling on the roadside and pulled over to check on her. The moment they got a closer look, they knew something was seriously wrong. She was struggling to breathe and looked totally out of it. One of them ran to a nearby pub to call for help, while the other stayed with her. At first, he thought maybe she'd been hit by a car, since she was so close to the road. He tried to comfort her, but her condition quickly got worse. Within minutes, she stopped breathing altogether, and by the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late. Her body was taken to the medical examiner, and the results were brutal. She had been stabbed 9 times, likely with a large knife, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Meanwhile, police began examining the scene and quickly figured out where the attack had happened. Claire was likely ambushed in a narrow alleyway that ran off the main road, leading toward her friend's house. Based on the wounds, they believed the killer came at her from behind. But beyond that, there wasn't much to go on. The alley was quiet, dark, and empty. No security cameras nearby. No witnesses. No useful evidence. Still, there was one thing that stood out. According to the medical examiner, the murder weapon wasn't just any knife. It was unusually large, too big to be something someone would just carry around in their pocket. Detectives believed the killer had brought it from home instead, already planning to use it on someone. News of the murder spread quickly through Claire's village and nearby towns. That evening, some students were still at school for exam prep sessions, and they heard about the incident on the radio. At first, no one knew the victim's name, but it didn't take long before word got out. With no solid leads, police turned to the public for help. A few people came forward, saying they'd seen a man in a light-colored coat near the road around 7 p.m. Another witness claimed they saw a man with dark curly hair walking out of the alleyway, but no one could identify either of them, even though it was a small community where most people knew each other. Based on the nature of the attack, detectives considered the possibility that the killer might have known Claire and had a personal motive. But there was also a more disturbing theory: this might not have been a one-off. They feared they could be dealing with a serial offender. In December 1988, 4 years before Claire's murder, A 27-year-old woman was attacked by an unknown man while walking home from work. Armed with a gun and a knife, he kidnapped her and drove out of town, where he tried to assault her. Then, he stabbed her 5 times and left her there, apparently thinking she was dead. But somehow, she survived. Despite her injuries and the freezing cold, she managed to crawl to a nearby road, where she was eventually found by a group of workers. She spent 9 days in intensive care, and doctors were able to save her life. But police were never able to track down the man who did it. And now, after Claire's murder, both detectives and locals began to wonder, what if the same person was behind both attacks? A few days later, Claire's funeral was held and hundreds of people from the community showed up. Just before that, her parents spoke with reporters and shared that they believed the killer might visit the ceremony. Detectives thought the same thing, so they attended the service and quietly took note of every single person who showed up. But even that didn't bring them any closer to finding the person responsible. In the weeks that followed, police kept questioning locals and chasing down leads, but nothing panned out. More than 2 years went by, and it started to seem like the case would never be solved. People slowly stopped talking about what happened to Claire, until one day, everything changed. On October 17, 1995, a local woman was walking home from work when she was attacked by a man just a few hundred yards from where Claire had been stabbed. The attacker hit her with a knife, and when she fell and screamed, he just took off running. Despite her injuries, the woman survived, but once again, detectives hit a dead end. Since the attacker came from behind, she hadn't seen his face or noticed any clear features. Still, this time, police caught a break. A witness came forward and said they'd seen a white Ford nearby with some pretty noticeable modifications. That detail helped investigators quickly track down the owner of the car, a local milkman named Colin Ashsmith. Police realized they'd spoken to Colin before, right after Claire's murder. Back then, he'd called them to report seeing a man with dark hair near the crime scene. But a few weeks later, when detectives followed up with him in person, Colin's story had changed slightly. At first, he claimed he'd been driving down that road around 6:30 p.m. Now, he insisted it was closer to 5:30. Still, he had an alibi. His mother told police they'd been driving together and were already home at the time Claire was attacked. But now, there was more reason to be suspicious. Colin drove the same white Ford witnesses had seen near another attack, and he was known for always wearing a light-colored trench coat, just like the one several witnesses described seeing near both crime scenes. He also had light-colored hair, and 2 different people had reported seeing a fair-haired man near the alley where Claire was murdered. That was enough for detectives to seriously start considering him as a suspect and to get a warrant to search his home. Inside the house, police found a large knife that matched the wounds on the most recent victim, but that was just the beginning. During the search, they also uncovered a hidden journal, and what was written inside left everyone stunned. In the diary, Colin admitted that he was the one who attacked the woman back in '88. He called it his masterpiece and even rated the crime, giving it a 95% success rate. When he later found out the victim had survived, he wrote that next time he'd do better. He also wrote about trying to sneak into a care home to kill someone, but said the plan didn't work out. Even more disturbing, he mentioned that some of his friends used to jokingly call him a killer after that first attack because of how obsessed he was with knives. He also said he threatened his first victim, warning her that if she gave his description to the police, he'd hurt someone else. On top of that, Colin confessed to the 1995 stabbing. He wrote that he'd gotten angry with his girlfriend that day, convinced she was cheating on him. Fueled by rage, he drove around looking for someone to take it out on. First, he saw a man, but decided that was too risky. Then he spotted a woman walking alone, stopped the car, and attacked her. He felt a wave of relief afterward and didn't care at all whether the woman lived or died. The diary also detailed his plans to commit more murders and even mentioned that he had broken into the homes of several women he knew while they were away. When police searched Colin's car, they found blood-stained clothes and a torn piece of a tie, which, as it turned out, he'd used in an attempt to strangle his first victim. That alone was more than enough to charge him in the attacks on both women. Detectives were also pretty sure he was behind Claire's murder too, and they started digging for a possible connection. It didn't take long to find one. Colin's family knew Claire's. They both spent time at the same local community center where residents would hang out and socialize. In fact, Claire had celebrated her birthday there just 4 days before she died, and Colin had been at that venue that same night. Investigators also confirmed that he showed up at her funeral. Still, they didn't have a single piece of solid evidence linking him to her murder. While Colin sat behind bars, detectives questioned him, but he denied everything. He did, however, offer up a theory. According to him, the killer might have been a guy who used to play pool with Claire at the community center. Colin said the guy left town shortly after the murder, and that the last time he saw him was at Claire's funeral. Police tracked the man down, but he didn't match any of the witness descriptions of the person seen near the crime scene. Colin, on the other hand, was a perfect match, but they still didn't have enough to make it stick. In the end, Colin was only charged in connection with the two attacks from '88 and '95. In December 1996, he pled guilty and was sentenced to 3 life terms, with the possibility of parole after just 15 years. But investigators weren't ready to let go. They kept looking for anything that could help them finally get justice for Claire. Out of all the potential suspects, Colin still made the most sense. But there were 2 major problems: a lack of physical evidence and his alibi. As you might remember, his mother had told police that she and Colin were out delivering flyers and were already home by the time Claire was killed. But here's the thing. Colin himself had called police the day after the murder and claimed to have seen a man with dark hair near the scene about an hour later. That call actually contradicted his own alibi. Based on what he told them, he would have had to have been right near the alley when Claire was attacked. That got detectives thinking, was his mom lying to protect him? After all, she wasn't just any mom. She was a former political party advisor, just like her husband, and she also happened to be the town's sitting mayor. When police confronted the parents again, they stuck to their story, insisting their son had nothing to do with the murder. Your detectives kept digging, and eventually, they uncovered the truth. Colin's alibi was completely made up. They found solid proof that his mother wasn't with him that evening, which meant she'd lied to protect her son. But that wasn't the only discovery. Investigators also learned something else, something just as disturbing. Turns out, Colin's father had gotten rid of a knife his son brought home after the 1995 attack. He admitted to boiling it in water, taking it apart, and disposing of the pieces just hours before police arrived with a search warrant. For that, he was sentenced to 12 months in prison. As for Colin's mother, her involvement didn't end there. Later on, she gave an interview to a local TV station and claimed it was actually her idea for her husband to get rid of the knife. She said she truly believed her son was innocent and was scared the police would try to pin someone else's crime on him. But even with everything they'd uncovered, police still didn't have enough evidence to charge Colin with Claire's murder. While he was serving time for the other attacks, detectives kept digging into his past, trying to find anything that could finally tie him to the crime. But nothing ever came of it. The only new discovery came during a routine search of his prison cell. Officers found several disturbing notes, filled with twisted and graphic fantasies about women he knew. Just like the pages from his old diary, they painted a deeply unsettling picture of his mindset. With no solid leads in Claire's case, investigators also looked at other potential suspects. One was a local man who had killed his own mother in 1994. After the murder, he left behind a note saying she had started to suspect him of being the one who murdered Claire. Another suspect was serial killer Robert Napper. He was convicted of killing 3 people, but detectives couldn't find any concrete link between him and Claire's case. From that point on, the investigation basically came to a standstill. Claire's parents were convinced Colin was the killer, and the fact that police still couldn't charge him for her murder weighed heavily on them. In 2008, Claire's mother passed away from cancer, and in 2012, her father died as well. Neither of them lived to see justice for their daughter. Then, in 2013, the case drew public attention once again when detectives made a renewed push to bring the killer to justice. They put out another appeal to the public asking for any information, and even the Prime Minister voiced support for their efforts. The tips that came in didn't lead anywhere, until one of Colin's former cellmates came forward with a story that completely changed the direction of the case. He claimed that one day, Colin had bragged about attacking a girl. According to him, Colin said he saw her at a crosswalk and something in him just snapped. That detail instantly stood out to detectives, since Claire had been using a crosswalk that led straight into the alley where she was attacked. The other two victims, on the other hand, had been found nowhere near crosswalks. That one clue strongly suggested Colin had been talking about Claire, or possibly another victim that police hadn't discovered. Still, detectives doubted there were any other victims because no other similar unsolved cases had been reported in the area. After speaking with Colin's former cellmate, police secured another warrant and returned to his house, hoping to finally uncover new evidence. As expected, they didn't find anything major, but something still caught their attention: a newspaper clipping about Claire's murder, published a year after she was killed. It wasn't enough to prove guilt, but detectives decided it was time to put everything they had on the table and try to take the case to trial. By then, a new law had also come into effect in the UK. It allowed prosecutors to bring up a suspect's prior convictions in court, which could be a game-changer for Claire's case. Colin was already serving time for 2 violent attacks, both strikingly similar to what happened to Claire, and committed just miles from where she was killed. Now, on top of that, investigators had testimony from his former cellmate and solid proof that Colin's alibi had been faked. That was finally enough for prosecutors to move forward. On February 12, 2014, detectives announced that Colin had been officially charged with Claire's murder. The timing was no coincidence. It happened on the very same day his first parole hearing was scheduled. Instead of walking free, he stayed behind bars, and prosecutors began preparing for trial. It took nearly a year for the case to go to court. Colin pleaded not guilty, but by then, he had already admitted to attacking 2 other women, and this time, he revealed even more disturbing details. He said he started sneaking out of the house at night when he was around 19 or 20. He'd take a knife with him and wander the streets, hoping to run into someone he could kill. According to Colin, it was all about feeling powerful, feeling like he had control over someone else, because he didn't want to be seen as weak. His ex-girlfriend also testified, saying Colin started acting really strange right after Claire was murdered. At the time, she just figured he was shaken up like everyone else in town. But looking back, she realized there was more to it. When Colin was asked how he felt about women in general, he said he both loved and hated them. He admitted he struggled with low self-esteem and constantly felt worthless, which made it hard for him to trust anyone, especially women. He also revealed that he kept a collection of 20 to 30 knives at home, along with a crossbow and a few air rifles. And apparently his parents were well aware of it. Colin even admitted that he never left the house without a knife. But when it was time for his former cellmate to testify, the prosecution hit an unexpected snag. The man said he couldn't clearly remember what Colin had told him and admitted he might have been confusing the conversation with someone else. Still, he did share one strange detail. He and the other inmates used to joke about how Colin had stabbed his victims multiple times but somehow missed all their vital organs. It became a running joke, especially when they played darts. The trial also took a sudden, heartbreaking turn when Claire's cousin suffered a heart attack during one of the sessions and had to be rushed to the hospital. Later on, the prosecution called a former mayor to the stand, and he shared something interesting about Colin's mother. At the time, she was a local counselor and, because of her position, she managed to attend a closed police briefing. She repeatedly pressed detectives for information about a car seen near the crime scene and demanded to know every detail. Considering she also helped her son fake an alibi, the whole thing came off as deeply suspicious. The trial lasted 5 weeks and, in December 2014, the jury reached a verdict. Colin Ashsmith was found guilty of murdering Claire Tiltman. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 21 years. When the verdict was read, Colin showed no emotion. He later appealed the decision, but the court rejected it, saying the evidence against him was overwhelming. So, after 26 long years, justice was finally served. In Claire's memory, local officials named a road after her and later even renamed a street using her last name. In 2022, A new community center opened its doors, proudly bearing Claire Tiltman's name. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. A young woman came to visit her parents for the weekend and disappeared without a trace. The police and dozens of local residents quickly joined the search, and soon they uncovered something quite unexpected. But when the whole truth finally came to light, the case sparked outrage that lasted for several years. Vanessa Marcotte was born on June 17, 1989, in the small town of Leominster, Massachusetts. Her parents divorced soon after her birth, but Vanessa's father remained very involved in her life. He stayed in the same town and tried to spend as much time as possible with his daughter. From a young age, Vanessa developed a strong love for nature and sports, thanks to her father. They often went hiking, skied in the nearby mountains, and visited the ocean to enjoy the beach. Later on, Vanessa became passionate about yoga and jogging, even taking part in 2 major charity marathons. Vanessa was also dedicated to her education and aimed to build a successful career. After high school, she went to Boston University and earned a degree in communications. She worked at several local companies before landing her dream job at Google, which led her to move to New York City. Vanessa was excited about her new job and worked hard to move up in her career. Even with her busy schedule, she made time for charity, trying to help others. Vanessa also tried to visit her family as often as possible. They lived in a small town called Princeton, not far from her hometown, which was about 180 miles from New York. In early August 2016, when Vanessa was 27, she visited her family for the weekend and stayed at her mom's house. She spent time with relatives, caught up with friends, and planned to head back to New York on Sunday, August 7th. That morning, Vanessa spent some time at home with her mom, and in the afternoon, she decided to go for a jog. With a few hours left until her bus, she had plenty of time to enjoy her run. She decided to run along the road near her mother's house. Although there were a few other houses along the way, they were mostly hidden by dense trees. Vanessa was supposed to be back in about half an hour, but she never returned. Her mom started to worry, knowing Vanessa still had to pack and catch her bus. She tried calling her, but Vanessa didn't pick up. About an hour after she left the house, Vanessa's phone started going straight to voicemail, making her mom even more anxious. She kept trying to reach her daughter, but there was no response. Her last hope was that Vanessa might have decided to meet some friends or visit other family members before heading back to New York. Her mom contacted all their relatives, but none of them had seen Vanessa. Fearing something bad had happened to her daughter, she decided to call the police. Officers spoke with her mom and began searching along the route Vanessa was supposed to jog. Her relatives and friends quickly joined the search, hoping to find her safe and well. Vanessa's bus to New York was scheduled to leave at 5:30 p.m., and everyone hoped she would show up by then. But when the bus left without her, it became clear that something serious had happened. Vanessa was very responsible about her work and would never miss the last bus. The search went on for several hours. The local police department requested assistance from the state police, who sent several officers with search dogs. Vanessa's father actively participated in the search and was extremely distressed. At one point, the police even had to ask him to go home because his anxiety was disrupting the process. Around 8:20 p.m., one of the search teams headed deeper into the woods, less than a mile from Vanessa's mother's house. The dogs led the officers in a specific direction, and soon they discovered a human body on the ground. Despite numerous bruises, the police immediately realized it was Vanessa Marcotte. Her clothes were missing, except for one sneaker lying near the crime scene. In addition to the bruises, there were clear signs of burns on her body, and the sneaker was also partially burned. The police thought that the perpetrator might have attempted to dispose of the body and evidence using fire, but failed. They also suspected that Vanessa had been assaulted, which could have been the motive for the unknown killer. Detectives noted that along with the victim's clothes, her headphones and smartphone were also missing. Since these items were not found anywhere near the body, the perpetrator might have taken them. The body was handed over to medical examiners while the police began searching for suspects. Residents of Princeton, who quickly learned about what had happened, were shocked and scared. Their small town was considered very safe, and the last murder had occurred over 30 years ago. Now, with the news of Vanessa's murder and the horrific details, the town plunged into panic. People feared that the killer might be one of their own, and worried that he could strike again. Medical examiners determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Vanessa had also sustained numerous injuries, some indicating that she had tried to fight off her attacker. Skin particles were found under her nails, and DNA analysis revealed that they belonged to an unknown man. Investigators immediately entered his DNA profile into the FBI database, but no matches were found. Despite this, the DNA profile became their only major piece of evidence. Now the police could compare DNA samples from suspects with this profile. They also knew that the attacker likely had fresh scratches on his body, which could help identify him more quickly. Regarding the burns on Vanessa's body, experts found traces of an accelerant and determined it was gasoline. It seemed like the perpetrator had tried to use it to destroy evidence and the body right after the murder. The medical examiners couldn't conclusively determine if Vanessa had been sexually assaulted, but detectives continued to consider it a primary motive. They also didn't rule out the possibility that the attacker might have known the victim and had personal motives. Detectives put all their efforts into finding the perpetrator and turned to the local community for help. With Princeton's population of just 3,000, many residents knew each other, so the police hoped someone might have crucial information. They also asked people to be on the lookout for a man with fresh scratches, and soon their efforts paid off. A witness came forward saying he had been driving along the road on the day of the murder, around 12:45 p.m. He saw a dark SUV with the hood up on the roadside and a Latino man standing next to it. The man was of medium height and solid build, appearing to be between 20 and 30 years old. The witness didn't recall any other details since he had driven by at high speed. The only detail he could provide was that the man had short hair or a completely shaved head. An hour and a half later, the witness drove back along the same road and noticed the SUV was still there. This time, the hood was down, all the windows were closed, and the man was nowhere to be seen. The witness added that he hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after hearing about Vanessa's murder, he realized he might have seen the perpetrator. Another witness reported seeing Vanessa that day as she headed toward the road. According to him, a car was following her. The driver first passed by, then turned around and started following her again. Unfortunately, the witness couldn't see the license plate or remember any other details about the car. Soon, detectives received another lead. A witness working at a ski resort 10 minutes' drive from Princeton noticed a suspicious man with a scratched face. This man was caught on surveillance camera, and the witness provided the footage to the police. Thanks to the footage, they quickly identified the man and began investigating his possible involvement, but soon concluded that he was likely not the killer. A DNA analysis later confirmed this, and the man was cleared of suspicion. Over the next few weeks, police received more than 1,000 tips, some of which seemed very promising. They diligently checked each one but repeatedly hit dead ends, failing to get any closer to catching the culprit. Detectives investigated local residents as well as people from other towns. They also looked into owners of dark SUVs, but none of these efforts yielded results. Vanessa's family couldn't sit still and wanted to contribute to the investigation. They put up flyers with information about the case in nearby towns and launched a website with all the details about the case. Despite the large number of tips and the community's involvement, with each passing week, investigators grew more and more discouraged. They had checked hundreds of men in the area and looked into Vanessa's acquaintances, but each lead ended up going nowhere. Several FBI profilers studied the case and concluded that the person who killed Vanessa most likely didn't know her and committed the crime spontaneously. They suggested that he might have driven by, seen Vanessa, and decided to assault her. They also noted that the perpetrator was likely living in Princeton or nearby towns, or regularly visiting Princeton, possibly to see relatives or for work. Given the brutality of the attack, the profilers speculated that the killer might be a sociopath, making him harder to identify. Sociopaths not only lack guilt, but are also skilled liars. The murderer could have acted completely normal after the crime, as if nothing had happened, and avoided drawing attention to himself. In the following months, the case made little progress, even though the local police department continued to work diligently on it. However, the more leads they followed, the less likely it seemed that they would be able to identify the perpetrator. But everything suddenly changed 9 months after the murder, in a quite unexpected way. In April 2017, a state patrol officer was driving through the town of Worcester, about 18 miles from Princeton. At one point, he spotted a black SUV with a Latino man with short hair behind the wheel. Vanessa's case was well known among the police in the area, so the officer immediately recalled that the driver's appearance and vehicle matched witness descriptions. The patrol officer quickly grabbed a pen and wrote down the license plate number on his hand while the vehicle was still in view. Upon returning to the station, he checked the plate and found that the SUV was registered to a 31-year-old Angelo Colon Ortiz, and he passed this information along to the detectives. Ortiz had no criminal record and had been living in Worcester with his girlfriend and 3 children for less than a year. Officers went to his house to request a DNA sample, but there was a problem. When Ortiz opened the door, they realized he barely spoke English. Fortunately, one of the officers knew Spanish, and Ortiz's girlfriend, who was also home, helped translate for him. During the conversation, Ortiz provided a DNA sample, which was immediately sent to the lab. While waiting for the results, detectives decided to dig deeper into Ortiz's background. They discovered that he worked as a delivery driver, transporting packages from a warehouse to various post offices in the area. This indicated that he knew the area well and frequently visited nearby towns like Princeton. Detectives also requested GPS data from Ortiz's smartphone, and the results were quite intriguing. Although the carrier could only provide approximate data based on cell towers, it showed that Ortiz was in Princeton at the time of Vanessa's attack, specifically in the area where her body was found. Digging deeper, police learned that after the murder, Ortiz made a purchase at a gas station in a neighboring town, just a few miles away. He bought only $5 worth of gasoline, as shown by his bank records. He had filled a small gas can and, as we recall, traces of gasoline were found on the victim's body. All of this strongly suggested to the detectives that Ortiz was likely involved in the crime. Soon, they received the lab results. His DNA matched the skin particles found under Vanessa's nails. With confirmation of his involvement, the police finally arrested Ortiz. He denied any involvement in the murder, so the case went to court. With the evidence they had, including DNA results and GPS data from the day of the murder, the prosecution was confident they could secure a conviction. However, an unexpected problem arose. When Ortiz hired lawyers, they claimed that the police had obtained his DNA sample illegally, meaning it should be excluded from the evidence. They argued that the language barrier prevented Ortiz from understanding what was happening and from giving consent to the DNA collection. Ortiz insisted that he had signed a document he didn't understand and only provided the DNA sample because his girlfriend told him to do so. This situation posed a major challenge for the prosecution. Even with the undeniable DNA match, the defense's request could have jeopardized the case and led to Ortiz being released. The matter was deliberated for quite some time, but ultimately, the judge decided to uphold the DNA test results. Despite this, Ortiz still refused to confess, and the preparations for the trial dragged on for several years. Throughout this period, Ortiz remained in jail as he was unable to pay the $10 million bail. In total, the wait for the trial lasted over 6 years from the time of the murder, with multiple delays for various reasons. For Vanessa's family, who had already suffered an immense loss, the waiting was extremely painful. During this time, investigators gathered more information that cast Ortiz in an unfavorable light. Though he had lived in the city for less than a year, Ortiz had earned a bad reputation. Several women in his neighborhood told police that they found Ortiz extremely unpleasant. He often made rude, intimate comments about them, and they were afraid to be near him. A former employee of the Princeton Post Office shared some interesting details. She frequently encountered Ortiz at work because he had been delivering packages. Almost every day, he made inappropriate comments in Spanish about her and another employee, seemingly unaware that she understood the language. She felt very uncomfortable every time he came by and was genuinely afraid of him. Moreover, this woman often walked to work along the same road where Vanessa had jogged. After hearing about Vanessa's death, she could no longer bear to live in the town and moved out. Eventually, the prosecution decided to offer Ortiz a deal, giving him a chance to be released at least in old age. Without the deal, he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. So, after some consideration, Ortiz agreed, and in October 2022, he pled guilty before the judge. As is often the case, the terms of the deal did not require Ortiz to provide any details of his crime. He only needed to admit his guilt, which he did. While the deal might seem unfair, the prosecution secured pretty strict terms. Ortiz was sentenced to 20 years for robbery as he had taken Vanessa's phone and headphones, and received a sentence of 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole only after 45 years. This means Ortiz can seek release only after he turns 81. Tragically, Vanessa's father, who had been awaiting justice for his daughter's murder, passed away just 10 days before the sentencing due to health problems. At the trial, his ex-wife stated that he died of a broken heart and unbearable grief caused by the murderer. Ortiz himself showed no signs of remorse or regret during his sentencing. Instead, he asked his lawyer to read a statement on his behalf. The lawyer stated that Ortiz understood why Vanessa's family saw him as a monster. However, he asked them to remember that he is also a person with a family that had supported him throughout the ordeal. He apologized to his own family for the pain he had caused them, but did not apologize to Vanessa's relatives. Ortiz was then sent back to prison, where he remains to this day. After Vanessa's death, her family and friends founded an organization named in her honor. Initially, they focused on offering self-defense courses for women, but over the years, their goals have expanded significantly, and now they work on a wide range of issues related to women's safety and the prevention of violence in all its forms. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. A young woman from France set off to visit her relatives in Britain for Christmas, but along the way, she vanished without a trace. Police immediately launched a large-scale search, and the case quickly made headlines in both countries. Before long, investigators pieced together a chain of clues that brought them closer to the truth, but what they uncovered was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Céline Fegard was born on May 23, 1976, in the French town of Besançon. It was a quiet and peaceful place, not far from the Swiss border. Céline grew up in a loving family with her parents, 2 brothers, and a sister. Her dad was a farmer, so she and her siblings spent a lot of time outside, helping him keep the farm running. The school. Céline was active in sports and had many friends. When she was 14, her parents took her to nearby Britain, and she absolutely loved it. From that point on, she started thinking about moving there someday. She decided to pursue an education that would allow her to work in the hotel business, inspired by her cousin, who was a hotel manager in the UK. After finishing school, Céline enrolled in a local university to study accounting. She also continued visiting her cousin in England whenever she could. One summer, he helped her get a job at a hotel, and she spent a few months working there before returning home. At the end of 1995, when Céline was 19, she decided to travel to Britain again for Christmas. At that time of year, public trains in France were experiencing disruptions, so her parents asked a family friend, a truck driver, for help. He was delivering cargo to England and agreed to give her a ride to a town called Folkestone. From there, Céline planned to travel to Fordingbridge, a town about 150 miles or 250 kilometers away, where her cousin lived. On December 18th, Céline left home, planning to reach her cousin's hotel by that evening. Her parents were expecting a call from her to let them know she had arrived safely. But as the evening stretched on, there was no word from Céline. She didn't have a mobile phone, so all her family could do was just wait and hope she would make it to the hotel eventually. Later that night, they finally got a call, but it wasn't Céline. It was her cousin. He told them she still hadn't arrived and asked if something had changed in her plans. Céline's parents grew even more worried and, with no other options, decided to contact the police. French authorities quickly reached out to their British colleagues, who immediately launched a search for the missing woman. Their first step was to speak with Celine's parents, who traveled to England to assist in the investigation. They told them about a family friend, a truck driver, who had agreed to give Celine a ride to Britain. The police tracked him down, and he confirmed that he had dropped her off in Folkestone. After that, he had to head in a different direction. While they were at the truck stop, the driver met another French trucker who was heading to a town called Newbury, about an hour's drive from Celine's cousin's hotel. This second driver agreed to give Celine a lift, and investigators managed to locate him as well. He told the police he had dropped Celine off at a truck stop in Newbury. She had tried using a payphone there to call her cousin and ask him to pick her up, but for some reason, she couldn't get through. By that time, it was already 4:30 p.m. The driver told Celine she could take a train to her cousin's town, but there was a problem. The nearest station was a few dozen miles away, and he couldn't take her there since he had to deliver his cargo in a different direction. He still wanted to help, so he started asking other truckers in the parking lot if anyone could give Celine a ride. The first driver he asked turned him down, saying he was planning to rest before his next trip. But the second trucker agreed. He said he was heading to Salisbury, just about a 30-minute drive from Celine's cousin's town. He even mentioned she could probably catch an 8 p.m. bus from there. With no other options left, Celine went with the third driver, and that's where her trail disappeared. Detectives tried to track this man down, but they didn't have enough solid information to identify him. The second driver, who had handed her over, couldn't recall the license plate number and only remembered that the truck was a white Mercedes. He also provided a description of the man. He was around 35 years old, had short blonde hair and a beard. The second driver also mentioned that something about this man struck him as suspicious. There was something unsettling about his behavior, but he still let Celine go with him because, at that point, she simply had no other choice. Police began to suspect that the third driver might have been involved in Celine's disappearance. Using the witness's description, they created a composite sketch and shared it with the local media. As for the first two drivers, investigators thoroughly checked their alibis and found solid evidence proving they had been in other locations at the time. Detectives soon uncovered a troubling detail that made them even more suspicious of the third driver. Remember how he told Celine she could catch an evening bus to her cousin's town from Salisbury? Well, it turned out that no such bus existed. Investigators wasted no time getting the word out about Celine's disappearance. They shared her story, along with the suspect's composite sketch, through newspapers and TV. The case quickly grabbed national attention in both Britain and France. It was just days before Christmas, and the disappearance of a young woman during the holiday season struck a chord with the public. On top of that, there were fears that Celine might have fallen victim to a serial killer. Over the past 2 years, several young women had been murdered in the same area. Police believed these cases were linked to a single perpetrator, and now they were worried Celine's disappearance could be connected to him. As a result, the local police launched a full-scale search. Over 100 officers were assigned to the case, along with helicopters and even an airplane to scan the area from above. They concentrated their efforts along the route the third driver was believed to have taken with Celine. But despite all their efforts, they found no trace of her. Unfortunately, the first week of the search yielded no results. Both the police and Celine's family made numerous public appeals, urging anyone who might know something about her whereabouts or the driver himself to come forward. But every lead they followed quickly turned into a dead end. This went on for over a week, until the morning of December 29th, when police received a chilling call. A man driving near the town of Worcester had pulled over to adjust his windshield wipers. While walking along the roadside, he noticed something odd partially covered by snow. Curious, he went closer and, to his horror, realized it was a human body. Shaken, he immediately rushed home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman, but at first, they couldn't identify her. Initially, they thought it might be the remains of a local woman who had disappeared after leaving a nightclub, but the theory was quickly ruled out. It wasn't until the following day, December 30th, that police confirmed the body was Celine's. Her cousin was brought in to identify her, sparing her parents the heartbreaking task of doing it themselves. Police quickly noticed one important detail. The highway where Celine's body was found was almost in the opposite direction of where she had been heading. This only strengthened their theory that the truck driver who had given her a ride was likely responsible for her murder. All of Celine's clothing and personal belongings were missing, and officers found no trace of them near the site where her body was discovered. The autopsy revealed multiple bruises and abrasions consistent with heavy blows, as well as evidence of strangulation. Medical examiners also found signs of SA on Celine's body, but there was no biological material that could lead them to the perpetrator. One chilling detail stood out. The examiners determined that Celine's body had likely been left by the roadside only about 24 hours before it was found. With 11 days having passed since her disappearance, detectives speculated that the killer may have kept her alive for most of that time or even transported her body with him. The second driver who had helped Celine mentioned that the suspect's truck was equipped with an industrial freezer, which suggested the killer could have preserved her body at low temperatures for days. Despite all this, the police still had no solid leads on the driver's identity. However, a conversation with Celine's parents revealed an intriguing detail. She had been carrying 2 bottles of champagne as Christmas gifts. These, along with all her other belongings, were never found. It seemed likely that the killer had taken them, which gave investigators a potential new angle to explore. This champagne was a specific French brand that wasn't sold in Britain, making those 2 bottles completely unique in the country. Police decided to use this as leverage and sent information about the bottles to the media, along with photos of identical champagne. They hoped that the perpetrator might have shown them to someone or even shared them with friends or family. But unfortunately, this lead also went nowhere. Without any other leads in hand, investigators decided to take an unprecedented step. Despite the absence of the perpetrator's DNA on the victim's body, in early January of the following year, they initiated the first mass DNA collection in Britain's history. The police focused their efforts on drivers of Mercedes trucks and similar models. This process took over a month, and detectives managed to test more than 5,000 drivers. Most of them willingly provided their samples, but there were some who refused. Investigators put them on a separate list for further scrutiny, thinking that one of those individuals might be the killer. Meanwhile, Celine's case continued to gain widespread attention in both British and French media. The police received thousands of tips and leads, but unfortunately, none of them brought the detectives any closer to catching the killer. This continued until mid-February, when one tip finally caught the investigators' attention. A man called the police after seeing the suspect's sketch on the news and said it looked strikingly similar to one of his coworkers, a 36-year-old truck driver named Stuart Little. He also mentioned that Stuart drove a Mercedes truck with a refrigeration unit. This lead prompted detectives to start digging into Stuart's background. The first thing they uncovered was Stuart's extensive criminal history, though it consisted of non-violent offenses. Next, they decided to approach him carefully and ask for a DNA sample, presenting it as a routine part of their investigation involving thousands of drivers across Britain. However, Stuart refused to provide a sample, which only deepened their suspicions. After several more attempts to persuade him, Stuart eventually gave in and agreed to the test. As soon as they had his DNA, the police secured a warrant to search his truck. That's when they found their first major evidence: traces of blood on the mattress in the sleeping area and in other parts of the cab. Testing confirmed it was Celine's blood, and that was enough for an arrest. The police also obtained a warrant to search Stuart's house. In his garage, they discovered Celine's personal belongings, the ones she had with her when she disappeared. But that wasn't all. Investigators noticed something odd about Stuart's tachograph, the device truck drivers are required to use by law to track their driving hours. It appeared that on the day Celine's body was dumped, Stuart had deliberately concealed information about his movements. However, he made a mistake. After disposing of the body, he resumed work without filling in the missing data. This created a suspicious gap in his driving log, which detectives believed corresponded to the time he transported Celine's body to the roadside. During his first interrogation, Stuart denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he had never even picked up Celine. But when police brought in the other driver, who identified Stuart in a lineup, his story changed. He now admitted to giving Celine a ride and claimed they had consensual intercourse. As for her belongings found in his garage, Stewart insisted she had simply forgotten them when he dropped her off. Naturally, investigators weren't quick to believe Stewart's story. They continued searching for evidence and soon found a witness who had seen him the day before Celine's body was discovered. The witness spotted Stewart near a warehouse about 50 miles from where the body was found. He was seen starting a fire next to his truck, and it appeared he was burning something. When police confronted Stewart about this, he claimed he'd started the fire to warm up his truck brakes, which had supposedly frozen due to the weather. Officers decided to search the area near the warehouse, and it didn't take long for them to find something disturbing. Underneath a fence, they discovered Celine's underwear. It was stained with her blood. Piecing together all the evidence, investigators came up with the most likely timeline of events. When Stewart picked up Celine, he drove to a secluded area where he assaulted and killed her. Based on the blood evidence found in his truck, they believe Stewart kept her body on the lower bunk in his cab for 10 days while continuing to make deliveries as if nothing had happened. Shockingly, just a week after the murder, Stewart went home to celebrate Christmas with his wife and children, while Celine's body remained just a few yards away in his truck. At some point, he decided to dispose of the body. Investigators found receipts showing Stewart had purchased a shovel, an axe, and a saw, likely with the intention of dismembering her remains. However, for some reason, he abandoned that plan and simply left her body near the roadside. Detectives soon uncovered another chilling detail. The day after Christmas, Stewart gave those 2 bottles of rare French champagne to an acquaintance as a gift. When detectives questioned him about it, Stewart claimed he'd bought the bottles from another French truck driver, but investigators didn't believe a word of it. On top of that, they uncovered another intriguing detail. Stewart had always worn a beard, but he completely shaved it off after the murder, right around the time the suspect's sketch started appearing in the news. They also figured out why Celine couldn't reach her cousin when she tried to call him from a payphone. It turned out that the UK had recently changed its phone codes, and Celine had his number written down with the old code in her notebook. Unaware of this update, she dialed the outdated number, and her call never went through. For Stewart's family, friends, and coworkers, these revelations were a complete shock. To them, he had always seemed like a devoted family man and a reliable friend. At first, many even refused to believe he could have been involved. But as the media revealed the mounting evidence against him, they had no choice but to face the horrifying truth of who Stewart really was. Stewart's trial began in October of that year, and despite the mountain of evidence against him, he stuck to his story, denying everything. But the jury didn't need long to deliberate. They unanimously found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. Soon after his sentencing, Stewart tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that the high-profile nature of the case had biased the jury, preventing him from receiving a fair trial. However, the appeals court rejected his claims. In 2006, Stewart made another attempt to have his sentence reviewed, but once again, his appeal was denied. 10 years later, in 2016, Stewart became eligible for parole, but his request was denied. The reason was clear: even after spending 2 decades in prison, he still refused to admit to the crime and maintained his innocence. The judge also voiced concerns that Stewart remained a danger to society. As of now, Stewart remains behind bars, with little chance of being released anytime soon. It's worth mentioning that Stewart was ultimately ruled out as a suspect in the other murders I mentioned earlier. Those crimes turned out to be the work of another truck driver who was arrested in late 1997. While prosecutors linked him to just 2 murders, they still believe he might be responsible for several other unsolved cases. As for Stewart, investigators also suspected that Celine might not have been his only victim. However, after all these years, no evidence has been found to connect him to any other crimes. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a young mother who was found in her own home under strange circumstances. Police began their investigation and quickly uncovered several alarming clues. But, despite this, they couldn't find enough evidence to solve the case, and it went cold. It was only nearly 60 years later, thanks to one phone call, they had an unexpected breakthrough, and the truth was finally revealed. Karen Snyder was born on July 29, 1948, in the small American town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She grew up in a very large family with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, Karen met a boy named Paul, and they decided to get married when she was just 17. Shortly after, Karen became pregnant, and in 1966, their daughter, Paula, was born. Even though Karen was only 18 at the time, she and her husband were ready and happy to start their own family. They moved to a town called Calumet, Illinois, where Paul's parents lived. The family settled on the same street as his parents, just a few houses away, allowing them to see Paul every day and spend a lot of time with their granddaughter. Calumet City, with a population of about 25,000 residents, was located not far from Chicago and considered a very safe place to live. Karen spent most of her time taking care of their child, while Paul got a job at the local railroad. On November 12, 1966, Paul went to his night shift around 2 p.m. A few hours later, he tried to call Karen, but she didn't answer. This was unusual because she was supposed to be at home and couldn't have left their 2-month-old daughter alone. Concerned, he called his parents, who lived just a few houses away, and asked them to check on Karen. They walked down the street and knocked on the door, but there was no response. His parents didn't have a spare key, so they continued knocking for a few minutes and then went back home to call their son. Paul became even more worried and decided to leave work early to check if everything was all right. As he approached the house, his concern grew even more. The porch light was off and the blinds were tightly closed. This was unusual because Karen always left the porch light on for him when he worked the night shift. Paul tried to open the door with his key and realized it was unlocked. He entered the living room and was relieved to find his 2-month-old daughter sleeping in a playpen near the working TV. However, Karen was nowhere to be seen. So, he began calling out her name while checking each room. As Paul decided to go upstairs, he tried to turn on the staircase light, but the switch didn't work. He made his way to the bedroom and turned on a lamp, revealing a horrifying scene. The room was in disarray, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor lay Karen, showing no signs of life, and Paul immediately realized she was dead. Recovering from the shock, Paul went downstairs, called the police, and took his daughter outside. While he was waiting for the police and ambulance, his parents came out to the street and saw him crying and pleading for help. Paul's mother grabbed a flashlight and rushed into the house, hoping to help Karen. But as soon as she saw Karen's blood-covered body, she knew it was too late to save her. Soon after, the medics and police arrived. The doctors could only confirm Karen's death, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. On the back door lock, they found shallow scratches indicating an attempted break-in. However, the door was still locked, suggesting the intruder initially tried to enter this way but failed. Next, they discovered a broken basement window with a trail of blood leading from it to the front door. Investigators speculated that after failing to open the back door, the intruder tried to enter through the basement and cut themselves on the glass, evidenced by the blood on it. The fact that the intruder didn't enter through the basement but went to the front door suggests it was either unlocked or Karen opened it herself. In the living room, they found more blood, indicating that the attack likely started there, catching Karen near her daughter's crib. The blood trail continued from the living room up the stairs, down the hallway, and into the couple's bedroom, where Karen's body was found. The bedroom was a chaotic scene, blood everywhere, and many items scattered and broken, indicating Karen fought back fiercely. There was a phone in the bedroom, but it had been ripped from the wall. Police believe Karen might have run there ahead of the intruder to call for help, but she couldn't. In those days, there wasn't a single emergency number like 911. Local police had their own number, so detectives thought she might have dialed incorrectly in her haste. Investigators also found a blood-covered light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed from the socket above the stairs. It seemed the intruder did this, though the reason was unclear. Perhaps he unscrewed it while following Karen upstairs, giving her a brief moment to try calling the police. In the downstairs bathroom, police discovered a pile of bloodied clothes and various items. Among them were a pair of pants, a bedsheet, and a washcloth. Detectives speculated that the killer used these items to wipe the blood off his hands and clothes. It appeared he also attempted to clean himself with the washcloth, or possibly tried to use it to wipe blood off the floor to cover his tracks. However, given the amount of blood throughout the house, these efforts were clearly futile. After using these items, the killer threw them into the bathtub and fled the scene. This indicated to investigators that he remained in the house for some time after the murder, although they couldn't determine the exact period of time. Detectives began their investigation and quickly ruled out the possibility of a botched robbery. The only missing items were Karen's blue wallet, containing about $50, and one of the bedside lamps, which had no significant value. Medical examiners found 124 stab wounds on Karen's body, most concentrated in the chest area. Such brutality suggested the attacker had personal motives. Experts identified the likely weapon as a knife with a narrow blade similar to a stiletto, but police couldn't find it inside the house or anywhere nearby. Karen was fully clothed and no signs of sexual assault were found, but investigators didn't rule out that the attacker might have had such a motive, but for some reason was unable to carry it out. The time of death was estimated between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Since Paul discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer must have left the house several hours earlier. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with the victim's relatives and friends. According to Paul's mother, Karen had mentioned being afraid to live in that house and said she wanted to move to Indiana where her parents lived. However, she didn't specify the reasons for her fear, and investigators couldn't find any more information. Karen's neighbors also provided an interesting observation. Their dog, which usually barked at the slightest noise, remained quiet that evening. With no other leads, the police turned their focus to Karen's husband. In such crimes, the spouse is often the primary suspect, so they began investigating him. After analyzing the evidence from the house, detectives concluded that the attempted break-in at the back door and the broken basement window might have been staged. The killer was likely someone familiar with Karen, but tried to make it appear as if a random intruder had committed the crime. This suggested that either Karen willingly opened the door to the killer, or they had a key. Investigators began interrogating Paul while also trying to establish whether he had the opportunity to commit the crime. They considered the possibility that he might have killed Karen before leaving for his evening shift, as he had left home after lunch that day. They also checked whether he remained at work for the entire shift, or if he had left at any point. Paul denied any involvement in the murder, but the police continued to view him as the prime suspect. With almost no evidence, they attempted to obtain a confession from him, repeatedly calling him in for questioning. But, despite this pressure, Paul consistently maintained his innocence. Karen's funeral took place 6 days after the murder. Besides family and friends, detectives also attended the ceremony and soon noticed something weird. One of the pallbearers had a deep wound on his forehead and a bandaged hand. The police identified this man as James Barbier, a friend of both Paul and Karen. He worked with Paul at the railroad and had done some repairs in the house shortly before the murder. Karen knew James pretty well and might have opened the door for him. Investigators began looking into James and discovered that on the evening of the murder, he had gone to a local hospital with serious injuries to his hand and face, requiring stitches. This aligned with the evidence suggesting the killer injured himself on broken basement window glass. James became the second suspect, and detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, explaining his injuries by saying that he had been returning home drunk from a bar that evening, tripped over a stump in the dark, and hurt himself on some splinters. James' wife confirmed that he came home that night drunk, with a bandaged hand and a cut on his forehead. She mentioned that he was acting weird and was visibly shaken, but she added that James was an alcoholic and frequently got heavily drunk, so this behavior wasn't unusual. When police interviewed individuals who frequented bars in Karen's neighborhood, they found witnesses who had seen James there that day. However, they couldn't pinpoint the exact times he was present. When experts finished analyzing the evidence from Karen's house, they found something intriguing. As suspected, there were 2 different types of blood. One matched Karen's blood type, while the other belonged to a different blood type, the same as James's. Although this blood type match was not proof of James' guilt, detectives decided to arrest him, hoping he would confess. They also cleared Karen's husband of suspicion, as none of the blood samples matched his type. James continued to deny his involvement, insisting that his injuries were from his fall. The police hoped forensic experts might find some additional evidence, but they faced disappointment. The fingerprints collected from the crime scene were smudged, and without DNA analysis, they couldn't make any progress with the blood evidence. Eventually, they had to release James and continued searching for new leads. Since then, investigators have looked into several other suspects and interviewed dozens of people, but the case remained unsolved for many years. Karen's murder forever changed their small town, once considered safe. Residents remembered the brutal crime for a long time and wondered who could have committed it. At the time, police did not reveal the identities of the suspects, including James, so only Karen's relatives and close friends knew of his potential involvement. In later interviews with reporters, they said they truly believed James was guilty, but without solid evidence, proving his involvement was simply impossible. Karen's father passed away in 1973, 7 years after the tragedy, and her mother died in 1977. Neither of them ever found out who killed their daughter. Paul eventually remarried, and his second wife helped raise Paula, essentially becoming the mother the girl never had the chance to remember. Her relatives decided not to tell her how her biological mother died, trying to shield the girl from the horrific details. Paula later recalled that when she started school, other kids teased her simply because her mother was dead. A few years later, understanding that she might hear the truth from others or come across news reports, her relatives finally told her what had happened to Karen. In 1989, at the age of 45, Paul passed away from health problems, never learning the truth either. For decades, there was no progress on the case. Paula occasionally gave interviews to journalists, expressing her hope to bring the culprit to justice and mentioning that she regularly contacted the local police department to ask about any new developments. But they always replied that there were no new leads, and the case remained unsolved for many years. This continued until the end of 2022, when one day the police received a call. A 29-year-old man contacted the police department responsible for Karen's case, inquiring about any new developments. The man explained that he had known about this crime his whole life, as his grandmother talked about it since he was a kid. It turned out they were distant relatives of Karen's family, and the man was curious whether the police had made any progress in solving the mystery. He said that he had been reading newspaper clippings about the case at work and wondered if there were any modern technologies that could help solve it, and this prompted him to reach out to the police. To his surprise, the police department decided to reopen the investigation following his call. Naturally, none of the original detectives were still around, so a new team began reviewing all the available materials from scratch. They discovered that almost all the evidence, except the blood samples collected from the floor, had not only been preserved, but was also well maintained over the past 56 years. This included Karen's clothing and various items from her home. The detectives sent all the remaining evidence to the lab, where experts began examining each item with modern tools. Meanwhile, the police re-interviewed everyone connected to the case who was still alive. 16 months after the investigation was reopened, detectives received a long-awaited call from the lab. Experts had found several drops of blood on Karen's dress and extracted a DNA profile of an unknown male. The police immediately obtained a warrant from a judge to collect a genetic sample from the main suspect, James, who was still alive. They quickly got his sample, sent it to the lab, and soon received confirmation. James' DNA matched the blood found on Karen's dress. This confirmed that James, who was just 21 years old at the time of Karen's death, had been in her home the day she was murdered and had initially lied about how he got his injuries. On April 29, 2024, the police returned to James' home and the 79-year-old man was finally arrested for murder. Upon being informed of the DNA match, James did not deny anything and confessed to the crime. While the police have not yet disclosed all details of his interrogation due to the ongoing legal proceedings, James admitted that he had known his entire life that he would eventually be caught. James has been charged with first-degree murder and was released on bail due to his age and severe health conditions. Given James' state, the risk of him fleeing was considered nearly non-existent. However, Karen's relatives were upset because they had already suffered enough seeing the killer live freely for over 50 years. As for the motive, it remains unknown. The first hearing took place at the end of May, and more details are expected to be revealed only after the trial. According to the main theory reported by journalists, James had feelings for Karen and was jealous of her husband since she married him. Additionally, James was indeed heavily intoxicated that evening, which may have driven him to commit the crime. Karen's relatives expressed their gratitude to the detectives for finally bringing James to justice. However, given his health issues, even if James lives to see prison, he is unlikely to spend much time there. Karen's daughter, who was 57 at the time of James's arrest, said she received the best call of her life when she learned that her mother's killer had finally been caught. She admitted she had lost hope and was surprised that the evidence had been so well preserved. She also revealed that she blames James for her father's early death. Beyond dealing with the brutal murder of his wife, her father had spent the rest of his life almost certain that his close friend was responsible, and it was very hard for him to see James continue to live freely. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A young woman was found in her own apartment under bizarre circumstances, and detectives moved fast. At first it looked like the case was basically solved, but pretty soon uncomfortable questions started piling up, along with contradictions that made people wonder if this story was really over. And when the full truth finally came out, the outcome shook everyone to their core. Tina Hines was born on February 27, 1974, in Wisconsin. After finishing school, she met a guy named Jeremy, and when Tina was 19, the two of them got married. Jeremy joined the Navy, and that decision basically set the direction of their whole life. They had to move away, ending up in Florida in a suburb outside Jacksonville. Around that same time, Tina found out she was pregnant. They were expecting their first child, and everything suddenly felt very adult, very fast. Jeremy spent most of his time at the military base near the city, while Tina worked at a restaurant. But she was also trying to plan ahead. Tina had applied to a university back in Wisconsin, and she was hoping that as soon as Jeremy could transfer out of Florida to another state, she'd be able to go back and continue her education. By April of 1994, Tina was 20 years old. They were still living in a small apartment complex not far from the base. Tina was 15 weeks pregnant at that point, and she was still working her restaurant job like usual. Around the same time, Jeremy's younger brother, Chad, came to stay with them. He was 19 and he had plans to settle in Florida, but at first, he just couldn't afford his own place. He was waiting for his fiancée to come down with their child, and until that happened, Jeremy told him he could stay at their apartment. There wasn't an extra bedroom, so Chad slept on the couch in the living room. And, as a way to say thank you, because they really were helping him out, he tried to make himself useful. Tina was in her 4th month of pregnancy. She was still working and it was a lot to handle on her own, so Chad helped her out with chores around the apartment whenever he could. That all continued until April 16th. Tina had to work that day and Jeremy had been on base for a few days already. The night rode on like normal, uneventful, the kind of night you wouldn't remember. Until 5:45 the next morning, when Chad called the police. He said he needed help and added there'd been a murder. Officers rushed to the apartment and, inside, they found Tina in her bedroom. She was lying on the bed with a pillowcase over her head, and it was immediately obvious she'd been stabbed multiple times. Her clothes were missing from the waist down, which made police believe she'd been sexually assaulted. Chad told them that the night before, he'd gone out drinking and got back home around 12:30 a.m., then fell asleep on the couch in the living room. About 2 hours later, he heard Tina come in from her late shift at the restaurant, but he said he stayed asleep. Then, at around 5:45 in the morning, he woke up to the sound of the fire alarm and the smell of smoke. When he opened his eyes, part of the couch he'd been sleeping on was on fire. And then he noticed there were 3 other small fires, one in the living room and others in the kitchen. Chad said he put the fires out, then went to Tina's bedroom to check on her, and that's when he found her. He also said that when he woke up, the front door was wide open, and after he discovered Tina's body, he ran to the neighbors and called police from their phone. Medical examiners determined that Tina had been stabbed at least 27 times, and they also confirmed she'd been sexually assaulted. On top of that, she clearly tried to fight back. There were scratches and abrasions all over her hands and arms. Detectives collected every knife in the apartment, but none of them matched the murder weapon. While the crime scene team kept searching for anything else, investigators sat down with Chad, and almost immediately, he started setting off alarm bells. They couldn't wrap their heads around how he could have been asleep just a few feet from Tina's bedroom and not woken up. Based on his story and what the scene suggested, some unknown attacker would have had to get inside, assault Tina, stab her dozens of times, and then start fires in 4 different spots around the apartment, including the couch Chad was sleeping on. And through all of that, he supposedly slept right through it. The only thing he claimed he noticed was Tina coming home from work, when he said he briefly woke up for a second. Suspicion got even stronger when police pulled Chad's record. He'd been arrested more than once, including an incident where a 17-year-old girl got pregnant from him. He was 18 at the time, and she said it had been consensual, so the charges were dropped after she married him. But Chad still had other run-ins with the law for theft and smaller offenses. So, detectives started leaning hard toward one theory: Chad did it. In their minds, he may have been fixated on Tina for a long time, and that night, he finally snapped. Then, after the fact, he set multiple fires to destroy evidence and tossed in the front door was open, detail to make it sound like some outside intruder. With all of that on the table, police arrested Chad and charged him with Tina's murder. He was held in jail while he awaited trial, and he stuck to his original story, repeating that he had nothing to do with it. Not long after, he hired an attorney. And that's when the defense started digging for anything that could back up Chad's claim that he was innocent. The first thing Chad's attorney pointed out was this: there wasn't a single drop of blood on Chad's clothes, and there were no bruises or scratches on his body. Nothing you'd expect if Tina had been fighting for her life and trying to claw her attacker off. Prosecutors fired back with their own explanation. They said Chad could have taken off the bloody clothes afterward, carried them out of the apartment along with the murder weapon, then washed himself off in the shower. They also noted that Chad had a burn on his hand, consistent with the kind of injury you could get from holding a lighter on too long. Then, the defense brought up something else. The forensic team had found multiple biological samples at the scene. Under Tina's fingernails, there were skin particles, and on the bed sheet, there were traces of male semen. But at the time, DNA testing was still pretty new in courtrooms, and it wasn't anywhere near as precise as it is today. So for a jury back then, it didn't carry the same weight. And experts couldn't say with certainty, this is a match, or this is not. On top of that, investigators found 3 stray hairs on Tina's body and clothing. Testing suggested all 3 came from the same person, and it wasn't Chad. Still, that evidence basically went nowhere because the analyst who examined the hairs couldn't provide an official conclusion about how common that hair profile might be in the general population. The DNA tools they had at the time just didn't allow him to calculate those odds. The prosecution, meanwhile, pointed to something Chad allegedly said early on. When he first saw his brother after everything happened, Chad broke down crying and reportedly said, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to do this." Jeremy also told his mother he believed Chad was responsible, even though he never publicly accused him of killing Tina. Chad, on the other hand, claimed he thought Jeremy could have done it. According to him, Jeremy and Tina fought constantly, and the marriage had been tense for a long time. But Jeremy had an airtight alibi. He was on a naval ship, and there was no way he could have physically pulled this off himself. The only scenario where he'd be involved would be if he'd asked someone else to do it, and investigators found nothing that supported that. So, officially, Tina's husband wasn't treated as a suspect. And then, there was the question police couldn't get past from day one. How did Chad sleep through all of this? His lawyer said Chad had a sleep disorder that made him extremely difficult to wake up, especially if he'd been drinking. And finally, the defense added one more detail. Jeremy and Tina kept a spare key outside near the front porch, and pretty much everyone close to them knew it was there. So if someone wanted to get inside, they wouldn't have had to force their way in at all. The trial didn't start until late 1996, more than 2 years after the murder. And by then, prosecutors said they had one more major piece that tied Chad to Tina's death. Chad had been sitting in jail that entire time, and 2 of his cellmates came forward claiming the same thing. Chad had openly confessed to them that he'd killed Tina. Both men took the stand and repeated that story in court, and combined with the rest of the prosecution's case, it was enough to sway the jury. At the end, Chad was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. So, officially, Tina's murder was solved. But Chad never stopped insisting he was innocent. 5 years after the conviction, he reached out to an organization that works on wrongful conviction cases, and they took a serious interest in his file. Once they learned that investigators had recovered skin cells from under Tina's nails and semen from the bedsheets, the organization, working closely with Chad's attorney, filed an appeal asking for the DNA evidence to be retested. By that point, genetic testing had come a long way, and in 2005, experts came back with a result that changed everything. The skin under Tina's nails, the semen on the sheets, and the 3 hairs found on her body all belonged to the same man. But that man wasn't Chad. He wasn't Jeremy either. His DNA wasn't in the FBI database, so they still didn't have a name. But for the defense, this was the first real hope Chad could actually be cleared. Then, they uncovered another detail that could have shifted the entire case years earlier. Crime scene techs had found a bloody fingerprint near the sink in Tina's apartment. Exactly the kind of place you'd expect the killer to go if he was trying to wash blood off his hands. That print didn't belong to Chad, and it didn't match anyone else connected to the case. Yet, for some reason, it had never been brought up at trial. Not once. And there was one more unsettling fact. Another inmate, someone who'd been locked up in the same facility as Chad, later claimed he'd overheard 2 prisoners talking about how they were going to set Chad up. According to him, they were literally discussing how to say Chad had confessed to them. Even with all of that on the table, the DA's office tried to block the case from being reopened. They kept insisting Chad was guilty, but his attorneys finally got a breakthrough. Based on everything that had come out, the judge overturned Chad's conviction. The problem was, the prosecution immediately announced they were going to try him again. So, Chad didn't walk out of jail. It took about a year to gear up for a new trial. But eventually, prosecutors had to admit the obvious. With all the evidence now in front of them, Chad being the killer just didn't look likely anymore. In 2007, they dropped the plan for a second trial, and Chad was finally released after spending 13 years behind bars. So, the case landed right back on detectives' desks, but the reopened investigation hit a wall almost immediately. The killer's DNA still wasn't in the database, and neither were his fingerprints, so the trail went cold all over again. That's basically where it stayed until 2017, when the local police department created a cold case unit. They picked Tina's case back up. But even 23 years after the murder, the killer's DNA still wasn't showing up in any database. In 2021, investigators decided to try something new: forensic genetic genealogy. They brought the DNA to a company called Othram, and the lab started building out a family tree for the unknown suspect, tracking down relatives through public genetic databases. It definitely wasn't quick. The whole process stretched out over 4 years, and it wasn't until September 2025 that Othram finally narrowed it down to one specific family, people who lived nearby in the same city back in the 90s. From there, detectives zeroed in on one person who fit the profile best. Next, they went to one of his close relatives and asked for a DNA sample to compare. The results came back, showing a very close biological link to the killer's DNA. And that led them straight to a 51-year-old man named Michael Ziegler. At first, this name didn't ring any bells, but when detectives started digging into who Michael actually was, they hit a detail that stopped them cold. Michael wasn't some random stranger. He was actually one of Jeremy's closest friends. They'd served together in the Navy, so they were basically brothers in arms. Michael had even stood up in Jeremy and Tina's wedding as a groomsman, just 5 months before Tina was murdered. By 2025, 31 years after the crime, Michael was retired and living in Georgia with his mother. He didn't have a serious criminal record, and as far as anyone could tell, he'd never even been in any legal trouble. And what's wild is that throughout the entire investigation, his name never came up. Not once. Even Jeremy had never suspected him, because nothing at any point seemed to point in that direction. To Michael stayed exactly what he'd always been, a friend and a fellow sailor. Until, over time, they just drifted out of each other's lives. Once police finally had a solid name to work with, they reached out to authorities in Georgia. Local officers moved in and arrested Michael. After that, investigators collected his DNA, and the results came back as a full match. The semen, the skin found under Tina's nails, and the 3 unknown hairs all belonged to him. With that, Michael was charged with murder and sexual assault, and he was extradited back to Florida. He's now sitting in jail, waiting for trial. And as of this moment, a court date still hasn't been set. At his first hearing, he pleaded not guilty, but with the kind of evidence stacked against him, it's hard to see how he avoids conviction. And, because this happened in Florida, he could be facing the death penalty. So prosecutors might eventually offer him a deal, life in prison in exchange for a guilty plea, taking the death penalty off the table. As for Chad, once he was released, he went straight back to Wisconsin to be with his family. And, after losing 13 years of his life, he didn't get a single dollar in compensation. The reason comes down to Florida law. If someone has prior convictions, even for minor offenses, they can be disqualified from getting wrongful conviction compensation. And Chad had those earlier charges on his record. Still, he says he's just grateful the truth finally came out, even if it took an absurdly long time. Right now, there's also no public information on whether Chad tried to go after the police or prosecutors who built the case against him, and it's hard not to wonder about that bloody fingerprint, found near the sink, not belonging to Chad, and somehow never brought up in trial. That detail alone could have changed everything. Whether it was an oversight or something more, we may never know. But it seems like Chad chose not to spend the rest of his life trapped in years of lawsuits. And one last thing, after Tina's murder, her parents set up a scholarship for low-income kids, covering tuition at the Catholic school Tina attended. That scholarship still exists today, and her family continues holding events to keep it funded. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.